Really happy to be here with you, at least virtually. And I'm also happy to have the chance to talk about my book. My book speaks to a time in American history when taverns were far more than places to drink, gather with friends, or spend the night during long trips. In the decades following the end of the American Revolution, taverns remained sites of political mobilization, as they had been from the start of the American colonies' conflict with Great Britain. Taverns also became increasingly significant to American economic development and territorial expansion. And because of their importance to Americans' pursuits of happiness, their individual and collective economic and territorial ambitions, taverns' political functions expanded remarkably. Taverns became places to define, restrict, test, and stretch the day-to-day boundaries of belonging in the new republic. And taverns' expansive possibilities were chiefly, but not only, available to the nation's white men. By the 1840s and 1850s, the US would become markedly more democratic for white men, thanks in no small part to partisan competition, print culture, and the process of establishing Republican institutions in which taverns played their role. But middle-class white women, usually seen as the enemies of tavern culture, and Black Americans, who are often the targets of tavern regulations and tavern violence, also used taverns for their own purposes. Acting both as individuals and collectively, they too helped shift American political culture in more democratic directions, albeit with different understandings of democracy. To put it another way, taverns were both vectors and theaters for American pursuits of mobility, economic opportunity, and Republican self-rule. People's access to and activities in taverns reflected and affected their degree of inclusion in the Republic generally. Or, in more colloquial terms, what happened in taverns didn't stay there. To make this case, I'm going to give you an overview of several major arguments I make about taverns and transportation, the spreading culture of gentility, trade and economic development, and politics. I'm also going to try to give you a bit of the flavor of the sources I used, such as newspaper advertisements, contemporary images, and personal correspondence. And I'm going to look both at some taverns on either side of the Hudson River and further afield. This audience may not need me to define taverns, but just in case, it's important to know that at the beginning of the 19th century, every state licensed tavern keepers to sell alcohol by the drink and required them to provide food and shelter for travelers and their horses or cattle. As keepers of houses for the public, or public houses, tavern keepers were also expected to maintain public order. In a nutshell, this meant ensuring that legal tavern customers didn't ruin themselves by drinking and gambling to excess. It also meant that tavern patrons, weren't supposed to be allowed to disturb the neighborhood with noisy carousing, with violence, obvious prostitution, blasphemy, or profaning the Sabbath. Lastly, tavern keepers were responsible for policing enslaved people, indentured servants, indigenous people, apprentices, miners, soldiers, and sailors. Most of those categories could only patronize taverns with the permission of a legal superior, a legal master, for example. Women, as such, were nowhere barred from taverns as a group. When they were excluded legally, it was through provisions upholding servitude and slavery, for example, or those concerning prostitution or excluding Indigenous Americans. By the mid-19th century, a wide variety of taverns could be found in the US. Some were very simple one-room log cabins, perhaps with a partial loft upstairs, and cooking, eating, drinking, and sleeping all took place in one room. Unhappy travelers sometimes disparage this sort of tavern as being worse than a dog kennel. The quotation on the slide says something similar at greater length. When ministers and public officials looked at this kind of tavern, this one-room so-called dog kennel, they often assumed that these establishments were mere tippling houses, their patrons disorderly drunks, and their keepers literal criminals. Such observers did not typically appreciate that, much like their rich contemporaries, humble men also came to taverns not only to drink, which they did, but also to share information, to pool their resources, to network, and to mobilize their social and political capital, however scant it might happen to be. At the opposite end of the spectrum from the so-called dog kennel or the log cabin tavern, we find elaborate, large, and increasingly expensive public accommodations as shown in the figures here. So-called first-class public accommodations could be urban or rural, but they typically served middle-class and wealthy patrons. Some had dozens or even hundreds of bedrooms and a variety of specialized dining rooms, parlors, reading rooms, and smoking rooms. First-class hotels typically sought to make themselves welcoming to families and female travelers, as well as to men, as suggested by the women shown in these two images of the Merchant's Hotel and the Marine Pavilion. Unsurprisingly, most taverns fell somewhere between these architectural and social extremes. Local patrons of a typical rural wayside tavern, such as the Spread Eagle Tavern, about a day to the northwest of Philadelphia, typically included small-scale farmers, craftsmen, agricultural day laborers, and a handful of local grandees. The traveling patrons would include peddlers, wagoners, some prosperous leisure travelers occasionally, lawyers and merchants, and also government officials who typically would come by stagecoach or in their own private carriages. Looking far to the south, we can see some similarities and some differences. Isaac Fraser's advertisement for his tavern in Columbia, South Carolina, tells us that he did steady business with drovers who literally drove, herds of horses, mules, and hogs destined for local markets. These animals would either be used, some of them used as draft animals, more often used slaughtered for meat. Fraser also had what he described as appropriate rooms elegantly furnished for gentlemen cotton planters and their families. By referencing their elegant or genteel accommodations, tavern keepers sought to appeal not just to the well-heeled, but to women and families on the move. As an aside, I looked at the available digitized newspapers and I didn't find advertisements for taverns right in the area of Grahamsville and more largely Neversink, which I think makes sense in both economic and political terms. This area had a relatively small population early in the 19th century. Growth was constrained by the leasehold system for a number of decades, and there were few bustling commercial towns able to support newspapers, which didn't mean that there weren't taverns in this area, as you'll see as I go on. Now, a moment ago, I mentioned the idea that some keepers explicitly appealed to families and female travelers. Bolstering taverns' appeal to women during the period of my study, the sort of the later part of my study, was a transformation in American drinking as represented on this slide. Simply put, in the early 19th century, many Americans drank a lot. In the early 19th century, they started to drink even more. Then, in about the mid-1830s into the 1840s, many, but not all, Americans drastically cut back their alcohol intake. A significant number of them joined temperance societies, anti-drinking societies, to help support themselves and also to help spread the message of temperance to other people. To take an example from the other side of the Hudson River, in Red Hook, two such societies formed in the 1830s, totaling perhaps 70 members by 1832. This change in drinking, this decline in drinking, created a new market for what were called temperance taverns, especially in the northern states. Temperance taverns either served no alcohol at all, or they served only beer and wine. But otherwise, they provided the services and amenities of what I call an improved tavern. These were typically larger, better furnished, and offered more separation between guests and the tavern household, and between different activities such as sleeping, cooking, and eating than most basic taverns could aspire to. These separations were not possible in your 1 or 2 room tavern, but they become possible as taverns start to proliferate rooms. And that's typical of these temperance taverns, which again serve little or no alcohol at all. To illustrate the improvement process, this image here shows how one keeper, this happens to be in Watkinsville, Georgia, wrapped a major expansion around an existing tavern. The existing tavern had been built on a basic 2-room plan, 2 rooms on the first floor, 2 rooms on the second floor. This expansion, which took place in the 20s and 30s, allowed the keeper to start offering multiple bedrooms, a separate dining room, and also create an extensive porch on his tavern. These images from Kingston and Grahamsville suggest varying possibilities for taverns over time, and what counted as an improved tavern would vary with location and with time. Elmendorf's Tavern in Kingston would have been a reasonably substantial tavern in the late 18th century when Elmendorf hosted Kingston locals, travelers, and patriots bent on resisting the British Empire. The Grahamsville Tavern, obviously a much larger and grander structure than the Elmendorf Tavern, came from a different architectural period and from a different social period too. Now, it's not entirely clear what it looked like in the exact time it was a public house, but if the building looked like that during its years as a public house, it would have been able to offer multiple bedrooms and distinct spaces for socializing and dining, more than had been possible at Elmendorf's in the 1780s, for example, but in keeping with expectations in, say, the 1820s and 1830s. To take another case for which I don't have an image, consider Curtis Lindley's Tavern in Thompsonville, another nearby town. Like the keeper of the Eagle Tavern in Georgia, he made substantial improvements, adding, a local historian tells us, a dining room and sitting room on the first floor and a courtroom above. Tavern keepers invested in these bedrooms, sometimes private bedrooms, parlors, and other enhancements, both to improve the living arrangements for themselves and their families, and to make their accommodations appeal more to travelers who associated updated furnishings, more differentiated spaces, and the possibility of privacy with safety, with comfort, and with refined personal manners and habits. These changes were especially likely in taverns that were well situated to take advantage of increased passenger travel. Simply put, you wouldn't make these investments in a place you weren't going to get a lot of customers. Here we have one of very many newspaper advertisements documenting the links between commercial transportation and taverns. And this speaks to the kinds of movements of people that would make it possible for some keepers to invest in expanding their taverns, either in anticipation of growth or, in fact, as this kind of growth occurs. So tavern keepers were crucial partners for stagecoach lines, and sometimes they were direct investors or co-proprietors of stage lines. Tavern keepers fed and watered stage horses, and they provided meals and shelter to drivers and passengers. And as you can see from the blue highlight on this slide, the Newburgh and Geneva line partnered with multiple named public accommodations, and also with multiple unnamed public houses along the 230-mile route, which again extends part of the route through the area that you all are in. The Newburgh and Geneva line of stages was also typical in that the advertisement is typical in that they draw readers' attention to the way that you can ride this line and then synchronize with steamboat traffic from New York City at the Newburgh end, and then at the Geneva end, the line intersects with several lines of daily stages to places of business, for example, in Rochester, and also for leisure travels, for example, to Niagara Falls. Now, one thing that this particular slide doesn't illustrate is that new railroads, starting in the 1830s, also in their early years, make use of taverns as passenger depots and watering stations. So taverns were thus constituent parts of the new nation's rapidly expanding and also rapidly developing transportation network through mid-century and beyond. In the Catskill region, we find stagecoaches remaining relevant through the end of the 19th century, in fact, and taverns remain relevant in conjunction with that stagecoach traffic. Oops, there we go. Okay, so the interdependence between travel and taverns meant that taverns remained, among other things, great places to get information. This painting by John Lewis Krimmel shows a mail carrier coming in the door, one of the circles on the left-hand side of the image. He's coming in carrying the mail. He's got a distinctive mail sack over his shoulder, and he's got bundled newspapers in his basket. Taverns were often post offices, as this image suggests, and tavern keepers themselves sometimes doubled as postmasters. As in, I'm not sure how to pronounce this local town, Coshington, where the tavern keeper Ebenezer Taylor became the first postmaster. I see Donna smiling. So I either got it right or totally wrong. Not sure which. I tried to look it up, but I failed. In any case, Krimel's painting also shows newspapers both on the wall, where I put circles. My animations failed me today, so I'm sorry about that. Newspapers are hung on the wall on poles so people can grab them. And you also see some of the people in the painting reading the newspapers, like the gentleman with glasses at the table who's reading probably out loud up on the newspaper. The image also shows a dimly illuminated writing desk in the corner. And then we see how the mail carrier is being greeted by people in the tavern who may have been there specifically to wait for the mail coach and the news and letters he brings. So this painting thus captures quite accurately some of the ways that taverns nurtured face-to-face rural communities and connected them with the wider written world. Krimel's painting also suggests how taverns assembled people from different walks of life. And this is where the blue circles, I want you to pay attention to those. In addition to showing a family group in the center and men of different ages, younger and older men, Kimmel is using attire to suggest a variety of occupations and social positions. So we have standing, a better dressed man with a white collared shirt and a waistcoat and a coat, and then the seated man in the center who's dressed in more casual attire, as a farmer, for example, might have dressed, or perhaps a shopkeeper might have dressed. Mixing with strangers in different walks of life was a way to gather diverse information. So this was useful. It was useful to have taverns assemble different kinds of people, but it wasn't always easy to navigate this kind of social environment. One reason for this was that people often talked about politics, and surprise, politics could be a source of conflict. A tavern visitor might be looking for information about the quality and price of local lands, for example, but hear nothing but the election, the election. As a young man, Roberts Vaux of Philadelphia observed, "At this time, every man is up to his armpits in politics." Visiting Charleston around the same time, a Briton noted that if a man did not want to risk his life at 10 paces, he should hold his tongue, as nothing is more common than an appeal to pistols. So tavern conversations could become violent or at least threatening on very little notice. Even in New England, a couple of decades later, when middle-class masculinity devalued violence, young or brash travelers could still get into difficulties, as New York City's Abram Hewitt and his friend Edward Cooper learned during a 21st birthday tour of New England. We don't know exactly how the cosmopolitan pair irritated the rural regulars in a tavern near Dover, New Hampshire, but they did. Hewitt wrote that the villainous-looking keeper of this tavern seemed as likely to knock us down as to pick his teeth. Combining the characteristics of the bulldog and the cutthroat, one of the patrons grabbed Hewitt and Cooper's walking sticks and commenced a sweeping invective against aristocrats. Afraid of being pegged as one of those aristocrats and perhaps beaten with his own stick, Hewitt launched into a general eulogy on laborers and Democrats to appease this ferocious gentleman. The journey of another New Yorker, the journal of another New Yorker, Sarah Howland, suggests more pleasant travels, but it also raises some questions. Sarah journaled her way through several family trips to Philadelphia, through Connecticut, through Rhode Island, up the Hudson Valley, and to Niagara Falls. An example of her Hudson journal reads, "Visiting Chappaqua Springs, Brewster's Inn, a very good house. Went to Peekskill and stayed that night at Coulter's Hotel, a poor place. Rode a few miles to breakfast, reached Fishkill, and slept at Ackerley's, a most miserable place." As the wife of a prosperous New York man of business, Sarah Howland, took for granted her right to prioritize taverns and pass judgment. But she wrote as if she and her family were the only guests at every wayside tavern they visited, and she made almost no mention of tavern spaces at all, whether bedrooms or bar rooms. On a busy route in the summer, however, she could not have avoided encountering other leisure travelers or men patronizing their local taverns, as the image I chose for the book's cover suggests. Someone like Sarah Howland would likely have had to traverse a porch to get into a tavern, and these porches were common features in early 19th century American taverns, and the ways that men typically used them created an often uncomfortable environment for respectable women to move through. Unlike the verandas of first-class hotels like the piazza of the Congress Hall at Saratoga Springs, tavern porches were clearly masculine terrain, as the Augustus Collner image suggests. Men are occupying them in casual postures. They're not standing up straight. They're putting their feet on the chair or on the baluster. Um, and men are smoking, often using foul language as they're engaging in homosocial sociability on the tavern porch. Taverns that offered private bedrooms or private parlors, as increasingly many did, make it possible for women travelers to limit their exposure to such behaviors, but they have to still walk the gauntlet of the tavern porch first, typically. By welcoming women, then, these taverns actually create even more moments when competing visions of good behavior come into conflict. People are contesting how to use these spaces, both inside and outside. At the same time, these taverns create valuable opportunities for the subset of men who can easily move back and forth between both groups, the men carousing in the bar or hanging out on the porch, or also choosing to be with women in the parlor. And in particular, for the kind of men who want to avoid hard drinking, tobacco spitting, politics disputing men, associating with women in more refined spaces gives them a new option. Now, if we widen our lens to consider the small but significant presence of Black Americans, one of whom is sitting on the porch in the Colner image, in fact, we add yet another dimension to our understanding of the relationship between taverns, travel, and everyday citizenship. It must be said that in the main, taverns were terribly grim places for Black Americans, especially the enslaved. Throughout the South, enslaved people labored in taverns, were bought and sold there, and suffered many kinds of public and private violence, including rape, mutilation, and sometimes death. Even when individuals did not experience the worst themselves, they bore witness. Very occasionally, however, enslaved people used changes in tavern spaces and tavern culture in their own bids for freedom, illustrating with perfect clarity how access to taverns represented both an index of and a means to freedom. Consider young Jermaine Logan, who escaped from a plantation south of Nashville with a friend. Unusually, the young men had horses and money, and their plan was to pose as free people of color. At least twice before they left the South, they stopped at taverns, a bold move that required convincing performances of freedom. In both taverns, the bar rooms were literally filled with white men, Logan wrote, in all stages of intoxication. At all costs, the enslaved men needed to avoid any confrontation with drunken white men, and so they asked for and received the use of a private parlor. While the bellowing of the crazy and drunken men kept them awake, their seclusion, a product of genteel culture and tavern improvements, kept them safe. Now, I want to pivot back to local patrons, who were in fact the majority in most taverns. What did taverns mean to them? Unsurprisingly, tavern keepers' account books suggest that taverns meant liquor and lots of it. Take the case of Martin Brown, a tavern keeper in Northern Virginia, another one for whom I don't have any images of his particular premises. But from his account books, I know that, for example, in 1803, 1804, nearly 90% of his tavern sales involved alcohol. He sold almost no lodgings, no meals, almost no horse feed. But like many turn-of-the-century village keepers, Brown actually traded in far more than the tavern goods and services his license covered. More than 40% of his patrons bought foodstuffs such as vinegar, molasses, and sugar. Nearly two-thirds bought something called sundries, and almost a fifth of his patrons owed him for textiles or clothing. And for almost everything from whiskey to woolens, Brown accepted payment in kind, in labor, in promissory notes, as well as cash, which facilitated the flow of agricultural products, non-local manufactured goods, and credit throughout his neighborhood. But a tavern didn't become a major community institution simply by doubling as a store for basic household goods. entrepreneurial locals also came to taverns specifically to introduce innovations into local economies. Sometimes these innovations had to do with basic infrastructure, like building turnpike roads, which made it easier to get goods to market and which in the meantime ideally would turn a profit for investors. That's the Buckhorn Tavern. Okay, that's another example of a tavern porch. Okay, these images suggest how turnpike corporations convened in taverns to do some of their business. And before turnpike companies were even incorporated, communities gathered, again often in taverns, to petition for roads to be built along certain routes. So there would be meetings to say the road should go from this town to this town in this way, and people had a vested interest in the tavern, in the turnpike road going close to their property. This is a highly political process, and keepers themselves, of course, have a vested interest in it along with any other landowners. Increased road traffic past their doors was likely to increase both the demands on their services and increased local values. As one local historian of your area observed, the first thing necessary to the settlement of a wilderness is a road leading from it to established neighborhoods. But sometimes, as in the case of the Neversink Turnpike Road Company, some of the landed proprietors invested in this particular turnpike road, while others, and I love this quotation, stood with their hands folded, ready to reap without cost or expense to themselves any profits or benefits that might accrue from the construction through the expenditure of the means and property of others. This is a nice encapsulation of what's known as the free rider problem. Why should I invest in something if other people will and I can get the benefits without paying? In some neighborhoods, holding shareholder meetings in taverns was not merely a convenient location, but a potentially useful way to pressure free riders to become investors. Because so many people came to taverns to socialize, to do business, and to share information about who was doing what in the neighborhood. Also, taverns that hosted one kind of forward-looking group, such as infrastructure corporations, often hosted others, such as agricultural societies, which we need to understand as improving and entrepreneurial in this period. Taverns also hosted things like mutual insurance companies and anti-theft societies, a whole variety of activities. Learning to think strategically about old and new forms of wealth creation and old and new forms of risk, as represented by insurance societies, represented an important step in spreading entrepreneurial, innovative mindsets into the often conservative countryside. And again, in the areas where the great landed proprietors were in charge for a long time, these developments happen somewhat later than in places where people are able to buy their land outright earlier on. Another thing that is important, and we do see in this area as well, is that entrepreneurial uses of taverns often take place in the same taverns that government officials are patronizing for public business, an overlap with intriguing implications. State legislators and local election officials often designated taverns as polling places, linking tavern going with that most visible and widespread act of political belonging in the early republic. In addition, in dozens of newly founded counties and hundreds of newly founded towns and villages, courts, jails, and town meetings were temporarily held in taverns. The first town meeting in Thompsonville was held in Abraham Waring's Tavern. Similarly, the residents of Coshecton, or however it's pronounced, held their first town meeting, in a tavern in 1829. That's a relatively late date for my study, but again, it speaks to the settlement patterns in this period. The overlap between taverns and governance is not entirely new, but it expands the traditional meanings of the public house, making taverns into houses for the Republican polity as much as for the traveling public. White men routinely celebrate the 4th of July in taverns, drinking toasts in honor of liberty and independence. But taverns could also be a place to gather against the government. In Massachusetts, in New York, in Pennsylvania, and Maine, to name just a few cases, public discontent with great landlords and unresponsive state legislatures led to major outbreaks of resistance in the late 18th century and sporadically in the 19th century. In each case, taverns provided far more than liquid courage to the protesters. They represented places to recruit and organize collective resistance. In 1808, for example, a deputy sheriff came to visit a particular Maine tavern because of rumors that it was the unofficial headquarters of Liberty men who were planning to disrupt legal proceedings against farmers who were being prosecuted as squatters on lands owned by speculators and great proprietors. When this deputy sheriff arrived at Broad's Tavern, he found a crowd of some 400 people, 400 men, waiting for him, including several dozen who were both armed and masked. Despite their threatening presence, however, the deputy observed later that the utmost order and regularity was observed among them the whole day. I found this phrase startling because it's often used to describe July 4th celebrations. Its use here suggests to me that the deputy saw some legitimacy in this self-constituted gathering, or at least knew that his neighbors would. It mattered that taverns remained places to test and temper public opinion in opposition to elected authority after the Constitution was ratified, because many of the founders believed they had closed the book on the revolution and its tactics. In this view, the role of the Republican electorate was simply to elect representatives, allow them to rule, and then elect new ones if they disapproved of the representatives' performance. In fact, despite James Madison's expectation that the Republic's vast size would impede factionalism, ordinary tradesmen, artisans and farmers, as well as wealthy and well-educated men, quickly started gathering in taverns as well as other places to discuss local, state, and national issues, figure out who they wanted to support, and sometimes to suggest course corrections to sitting representatives. By the end of the 1790s, both the Washingtonian Federalists and their Jeffersonian Republican opponents regularly held tavern meetings at which ordinary voters practiced what were increasingly understood as everyday political skills in a republic: deliberating upon men and measures, crafting resolutions to appeal to a wider public, forming committees to accomplish specific tasks, and building strategies and processes to maintain their momentum between elections. This kind of political activity was not entirely reserved for white men. Pre-election organizing attracted Black voters as well, as we can see in these newspaper clippings from New York City. Black Federalists met at a few different Lower Manhattan taverns in 1808 and 1809, for example, to discuss elections and President Thomas Jefferson's policies. In 1808, Black Federalists met for electoral nominations, spoke in favor of peace, and condemned Jefferson's unpopular trade embargo against Great Britain, which they attributed, in a phrase I love, to executive imbecility and foreign influence. And just as an aside, contrary to our long assumptions about white manhood suffrage in this period, Black men continued to vote in multiple states in the North in the early to mid-19th century. And while their numbers were small, their votes actually often mattered in deciding important elections. In the 1820s, village and town taverns became crucial organizing spaces in what turned out to be a critical decade of realignment. In 1824, voters held meetings at locally important taverns where they could get basic information about the presidential election, nominate candidates, or participate in partisan organizations, as the excerpt from the Haverhill newspaper suggests. And the point there is that there's a spectrum of possibilities from the nonpartisan to the partisan. Because of meetings like these in taverns and other venues in villages, towns, and cities across the nation, when Andrew Jackson was elected to the presidency in 1828, his supporters had reason to believe that they had helped make the democracy, as his supporters were called, from the bottom up. It's worth remembering, however, that tavern meetings were not exclusive to Jackson men. John Quincy Adams's supporters had also participated in many tavern meetings, forming committees and sending delegates to their own conventions, some of which are reflected in the Baltimore clip from 1828. Also important in shaping the political climate of the 1820s and after was the growing reality that, as Alexis de Tocqueville noted, Americans of all ages, all conditions, and all dispositions constantly form associations. As I mentioned before, Americans worked together to build turnpike roads and improve agriculture and manufacturing. Both women and men also formed and joined associations to support, for example, education and poor relief, and to promote more radical causes such as temperance and anti-slavery. Many of these associations drafted constitutions and resolutions, elected officers, and had regular meetings, whether at the local, state, or national level. In other words, they too were a means of practicing Republican self-government, and that encompassed non-voting women as well as voting men. A surprising variety of these associations met in taverns. Although doctors were among the loudest voices condemning excessive drinking, some of the early New England medical societies held their meetings in taverns. The occasional temperance society met in taverns, a further demonstration of the new temperance niche in public accommodations. Missionary societies collected at least a little bit of money from collecting boxes left in taverns and hotels, as illustrated through the Missionary Herald in 1829. The radical anti-slavery societies, one of the most radical causes in the early 19th century, usually convened in other places, such as churches and town halls, but their meetings occasionally took place in town taverns, which sometimes took the name of hotel rather than tavern, by the 1830s and 40s. Hold on a second. So abolitionists, like other reformers, also patronized taverns and hotels while traveling on their lecture tours. And abolitionists faced an unusually high risk of verbal and even physical abuse at their lectures and meetings and during their travels generally. At its worst in the 1830s, late 1830s, anti-abolition violence extended to murder, riot, and arson, and especially targeted, not surprisingly, Black individuals and communities. In the 1840s and 1850s, open violence was less common, but even in the temperance taverns and hotels that welcomed white abolitionists, Black abolitionists often encountered distinctly second-class hospitality. At Boston's Marlborough Hotel, for example, known for its temperance platform and its anti-slavery patrons, Black performer Mary E. Webb could get a room to sleep in, but she was barred from both the dining room and the on-site religious services. As Frederick Douglass put it, the management refused to treat her as a woman and a sister, in the common abolitionist phrase. Now, what I want you to note in the newspaper clipping is that the news of Mary Webb's ill treatment in Boston made it into an Ohio anti-slavery newspaper, which mentioned by name both the hotel which treated her badly and another one which welcomed her. Black abolitionist publishers seized every opportunity to name and shame taverns and hotels that mistreated Black travelers and instructed their readers to patronize other establishments. For example, the American Hotel and Durham House in Cleveland, Ohio, which treated Black travelers with the respect and attention commonly paid to other travelers. The occasions which brought Black men and women to hotels and taverns at mid-century, meanwhile, were often overtly political, giving anti-slavery lectures and attending abolition conventions. In the 1850s, in short, access to public accommodations was more than ever an important index of citizenship. And I ran into a lawsuit which made this point in I think, really striking language. So in 1855, an Alabama attorney, Charles P. Robinson, was the attorney for in a suit about tavern keepers' liability for lost property. And in arguing for his client, he said, in the United States, a common language, common ideas, common laws, the habit of traveling, equal knowledge, and an active intelligence have clothed the traveler with a citizenship wherever his journey leads him. Robinson was as correct about travel's significance as he was wrong in suggesting that all travelers were equally clothed with citizenship. Just a few years before, Southerners in Congress had ensured that Black and white Northerners had to reassess their position in the Republic. The 1850 Fugitive Slave Act told white Northerners that they could be forced to assist federal marshals in capturing alleged fugitives and rendering them to bondage. Under the same law, judges were paid $10 if they consigned a supposed fugitive to slavery, but only $5 for restoring them to freedom. And anyone accused of being a fugitive was barred from testifying in their own defense. The act thus told Black Northerners, even those born free, that they would not receive meaningful due process if they were apprehended. As at any historical inflection point, resistance to the Fugitive Slave Act crisis took many forms. Some African Americans emigrated, some of them to Canada or Britain, for example. Some white and Black Americans overtly resisted efforts to enforce the Fugitive Slave Act or formed militias in preparation to resist its enforcement. Eventually, a new political party, the Republican Party, would form, forged out of the pressure that the slave power was said to be putting on Northerners' freedom of speech, movement, assembly, political choices, and economic prospects. And the Republican Party's argument was that the slave power was hurting white people's economic prospects, political freedom, and so on. In 2026 rather, new year, there is no direct analogy to early 19th century taverns. No single institution, public or private, combines all the functions that were once common to thriving town and village taverns. Instead, we have many different public spaces, some commercial, like modern convention centers, and some nonprofit, such as our vital public libraries and our community museums. And we have new categories of privately owned spaces that operate as public spaces in a limited set of ways, such as shopping malls. But one key continuity is that access to all of these spaces and the freedom to move freely within and between them remain intimately connected to economic opportunity and political rights. For today's Americans, whether we can safely and easily access these public spaces in our own neighborhoods or while moving across the country continues both to reflect and to shape our individual freedom, our economic horizons, and the very meaning of American citizenship. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was really super. I really appreciate you coming